Right, I believe we are streaming. Yes, we are. Hello and welcome back. This is the 19th session of the home study of the Kitáb-i-Íqán with Peter Terry. And Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay, so let's see if I can take a look and see who's here. Yeah, I see who's here for now. Okay, and I think as Jeremiah said, more people will be coming in. Now, we've been reading the group of us that started this program have been reading this book a few paragraphs at a time, somewhere up to about 20 paragraphs that get talked about at the end of each period. And we've been doing this for quite a while, and it gives you an idea of how long it takes to really dive deeply into this ocean of Baha'u'llah's word and get something out of it. That's not to say that that there are many ways to read it, but I'd be really surprised if there's anybody who read it as fast as he revealed it. And surprised if there's anybody who read it as fast as he revealed. Now my audio is coming back to haunt me. Is that for some particular reason? Is there a delay on my end or a delay on your end?
No, my apologies, Peter.
Okay.
I was muted.
Okay. All right. So this is I've come in my own experience to realize that every time that you read this book, you understand a little more than you did before. But you got to go back. You got to go back and read it again, because its riches are so many and so widely disseminated. And sometimes we read through things and they don't click for us. For example, at the end of 207, it says, "Satisfied with the croaking of the crow and enamored with the visage of the raven, they have renounced the melody of the nightingale and the charm of the rose." And that's not sort of language that we hear on a regular basis. But I recall when I was in, I think it was middle school, and I first read Edgar Allan Poe's poem, "Quoth the Raven Nevermore." And that image of the raven in that poem has stayed with me for life. And so when I see the visage of the raven, that poem comes back to me. And then I think this is so true of many people, that these images that he refers to, they have deep cultural roots, not just in one culture, but clearly, to begin with, they had very deep roots in Iran. And this idea of contrasting the crow and the raven on one side and the nightingale and the rose on the other, this is found throughout the poetry of the great Muslim poets of Iran. And so the resonation of this language is extremely powerful for the reader. We tend to I remember when I first read this and I thought it was flowery, and people would describe it as flowery, and I thought, well, I didn't have the wherewithal to be able to respond to their comments at the time. But over the years, I've come to realize every flower that's in here is here for a really important purpose. So there's nothing that's misplaced. And when you find Baha'u'lláh reiterating a theme, which he does, it's because there's somebody out there that needs to hear it again. needs to hear it in a different way. This is what we teachers do all the time. And all of us are teachers, really. Anybody who's had kids has been a teacher. Everybody who's run an office has been a teacher, because you've had to teach people to do a job in your office. And I could go on and on. But this, you have to explain things in different ways to different people. And hearing them in different ways reinforces our understanding of what these things mean. And sometimes he says things that are really startling, because we wouldn't expect the manifestation of God. And the manifestations of God, according to Bahá'u'lláh, are the only people who appear on earth who have the most great infallibility. That means that they have infallibility over and above any other person or institution that ever exists. Constitutionally, innately, they have this infallibility. And here he says, what unspeakable fallacies the perusal of this pretentious book hath revealed. They are too unworthy for my pen to describe, and too base for one moment's attention. It's wonderful to have him, he who knows vastly more than any of us, to tell us, don't even bother. Don't even bother. And this brings back to us this very important concept that we find in Baha'u'llah's writings, that there's knowledge, all knowledge is not equal. All knowledge is not the same. There's plenty of knowledge that is highly regarded by a particular society or in a particular epoch, and the actual value of that science or that knowledge is minimal to nothing. It can even be harmful. And we tend to think that the knowledge that is being promoted in our own time is of infinitely greater value than anything that was known before, particularly when our particular culture seems to be doing pretty well and getting a lot of attention, and the media and our politicians have a great talent for depicting other cultures in such a way that we are convinced that we're superior to them. But the reality is that this matter of what is important knowledge and what is not important knowledge is something that we have to face in every day, in every culture, in every individual has to do it. Now, this is very interesting when you consider this. When you talk about, I asked the question, what is the touchstone? The touchstone is a concept that's found in a great deal of philosophy and some also mystical writings. The touchstone is a particular entity according to which all things are referred, and that has the power to transform them. Baha'u'lláh also talks about the elixir, and the elixir is like this potion that changes human consciousness. But of course, it had many other implications depending on the field that it was applied to. And these terms are found in poetry, they're found in philosophy, they're found in mysticism. You could find them going way, way, way back. And the culture that we find referred to in the Baha'i writings is in many cases as old as the Greeks and older. It goes even back to the ancient Persians, probably close to about 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. So here's Baha'u'lláh talking about something. Among the sciences which this pretender hath professed is that of alchemy. And then Baha'u'lláh says, we cherish the hope that either a king or a man of a preeminent power may call upon him, in other words, this man, to translate this science from the realm of fancy to the domain of fact, and from the plane of mere pretension to that of actual achievement. Bahá'u'lláh is big on sciences and arts that actually are of benefit to human beings. He's very critical of those intellectual and mystical pastimes that don't get anything that's good for us, that have no fruits, that have no benefit. Now, I'm bringing this up when it comes to alchemy, because he made quite an extraordinary prediction in one of his tablets, which is cited at the very end of the Kitáb-i-Íqán. There's a passage that talks about the signs of the coming of age of humanity. And one of the signs that he cites in that passage from Kitáb-i-Íqán is that we will all speak the one language. Another one, he says, I've talked about it previously in my writings. And there's a note that explains that this matter, this is one of the signs of the coming of age of humanity, is called that divine philosophy that includes the transmutation of elements. So what is alchemy? Alchemy is the transmutation of elements. So this is not a case of where Bahá'u'lláh contradicts himself. It's a case where he's pointing out that the search that is an ancient one to find a particular chemical agent that would transform one substance into another has been, up to now, unsuccessful. But in this day and age, it will be realized. And that it will be in some way connected to what he calls divine philosophy. And divine philosophy, as Abdu'l-Bahá described in a number of his talks, and which Bahá'u'lláh describes in the Tablet of Wisdom, the Loy Hekmat, one of the tablets that is revealed after the Kitáb-i-Íqán and included in that volume. Bahá'u'lláh talks about divine philosophy, and divine philosophy is going to be a way in which people come to understand metaphysics as well as physics. In other words, the physical world and the spiritual worlds in an objective manner, and also in a manner that is very closely connected to divine revelation. So when we read, and this often occurs with Bahá'u'lláh, when we read Bahá'u'lláh saying something and pointing out its limitations in one context, it doesn't mean he's condemning it. It doesn't mean he's saying it's not important. It means that the way it was handled by this guy was useless because he didn't get it. He didn't understand what alchemy really is and how it works. But as far as the future, that doesn't mean that it won't be of some value in the future. So let's go on to 200. Oh, yes. Now, we did talk about this quotation in the previous session, but it's good for us to repeat it. Bahá'u'lláh says something quite astonishing here, and it's something that should encourage us to study the Quran. He says that everything is actually found in the, actually he says this in the beginning verse of 210. First in 2:9, he talks about the specific verses that are referring to Mirza Karim Khan that are in the Quran. Now, let's think about that for a second. The Quran was revealed a long time ago. like when he wrote this, about 1300 years. And the Quran was talking about this individual, according to Baha'u'lláh. And he goes on in the next, in 210, to say, ponder the blessed verse of the meaning of the words, there is neither a thing green nor sere that is noted in the unerring book. His point here is that the revelation of God is a source of truth that is eternal. We only see part of what it's telling us. The manifestation can see a lot more. And he tells us, go back to this source over and over again, go back to it, because it will yield more truth than you will see on the surface. It's so important for us to understand literalism has been a tremendous limiting factor in religious understanding for thousands of years, and Baha'u'lláh is liberating us from literalism. That's not to say that there aren't literal meanings. Of course there are, but they do not contain everything that's important about the Word of God. The Word of God is unlimited in its meanings, and those meanings are to be discovered through the manifestation and through our own meditation, through our own reading and thought and prayer. Let's go. Excuse me for clearing my throat in your ears. In 211, Baha'u'lláh gives us this reminder to all people who are reading this book to remember that who created us and what he placed in us. He placed in us a capacity to recognize the truth. Not everybody has that capacity. One of the signs of being on the road to developing that capacity is to recognize the manifestation, but then it takes a whole lifetime afterwards. And in 2012, again, this reiteration that there are, for those people who are initiated into the divine mysteries. Now, it doesn't sound like, you and I may not think of ourselves as initiated into the divine mysteries, but that's how Baha'u'lláh describes us. That's what we're doing. What deepening is, what study of the writings is, what meditation on them and contemplation of them is exactly that. We're initiated in a way that's really quite unique, because we don't have priests and we don't have gurus and we don't have people who lay hands on us to make us wake up. We're doing it ourselves. And we're doing it ourselves because we can, because he assures us that we're capable of this. And I'm reminded of the Guardian's depiction of our present time as a period of adolescence. Because as we all know about adolescents are capable of knowing. They just don't want to. They want to do their own thing, and they don't want you to tell them what to do. They may very well know that what you have to say to them is true, but they're self-willed. And Certainly humanity is full of adolescent attributes in our day and age. So this beginning in 2013, we have two passages which are probably the most cited by Baha'is. We like them so much, we call them the tablet of the true seeker. Of course, it's not a separate tablet at all. Many of its teachings can be found almost word for word in the 7 valleys, in the 4 valleys, in the hidden words. Some of them are, as far as I know, not found in any of the Baha'i writings that have been translated apart from the Kitáb-i-Íqán. So some of them seem to be quite unique. But for the most part, these are ideas that we encounter throughout Baha'i scripture. And they are depicting the path of the seeker. Now, so interesting about this is the seeker, as Bahá'u'lláh describes the seeker. The seeker is not somebody who has no knowledge of religion, no commitment to religion, no, shall we call it, path in religion. It's somebody who is already acquainted, but hasn't dedicated himself or herself yet to establish a relationship with God that will direct all he does. Direct every action of your life. To be God intoxicated, to be God enveloped in consciousness. And that's what this is about. This is really saying, you want to know who the manifestation really is. You want to know what religion is really about. Here it is. I'm going to spell it out. And he begins with detachment. Just as the very first words of the valley of search in the 7 valleys begin with detachment, begin with purification, begin with cleansing yourself of all your attachments and your preconceived ideas. And as many of you know from the story in the gospel of Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, mind you, Jesus didn't have to purify himself because he was already pure. But the manifestations do this. This has been true also the Bab. The Bab went on a long retreat as well. And Bahá'u'lláh went on a long retreat. He went to Suleymaniya and lived in a cave. So we know that this is something manifestations do too. In effect, they model this behavior. This is something you have to do if you're going to really find the truth. You have to take time out and look for it properly. So the first paragraph is all about the spiritual attributes of those who are going to investigate the truth for themselves. And I don't believe that it's necessary to explain these verses because I think they're very self-evident in meaning. And in fact, he says things over and over again just to make sure that you got it. For example, he's already told you need to be detached and purified and cleansed. And now he says, and he says, you should have no remnant of either love or hate of the world, lest that love blindly incline to error, or that hate repel away from the truth. But he's going to get really down into it here, where he says you have to wash away from the tablet of your heart every trace of pride and vainglory. Must cling to patience and resignation, observe silence and refrain from idle talk. This is the perfect season, by the way, for people to do this kind of search. And I think that Baha'u'lláh reiterates that in the prayers for the fast. So after he talks about these spiritual prerequisites, at the very end, he starts talking about behavior. For the tongue is a smoldering fire, and excessive speech a deadly poison. Material fire consumeth the body, whereas the fire of the tongue devoureth both heart and soul. The force of the former lasteth but for a time, whilst the effects of the latter endure a century. These are the beginning of his describing actions, not just states of heart and mind, but actions that we need to take. The next one is the very next paragraph is going to talk in detail about actions. So he starts with backbiting. Now, backbiting is Baha'u'lláh is very critical of those people who engage in violent verbal battles with each other. But what he considers much more damaging than disagreement with other people and insisting on your point of view is backbiting. Because backbiting is going behind somebody's back. Backbiting is judging somebody and criticizing them without them having the opportunity to defend themselves or to respond. And this is just unjust. It's wrong. It's wrong. And it is ingrained in so many cultures. So many cultures, people avoid direct contact with each other when they are upset. And instead, they go and rag on that person right and left with this one and that one. You know, we probably, if people could resolve this addiction to backbiting, we'd probably put most of the therapists out of work, because most of the time they spend listening to us say how awful this one is and how awful that one is. And he's very strong in this language. Backbiting quencheth the light of the heart and extinguisheth the life of the soul. It's deadly. And then he talks about being content with little, being freed from inordinate desire, treasuring the companionship of those who have renounced the world, and regard the avoidance of boastful and worldly people a precious benefit. These are it, and each one of these counsels that he's going to give, every single one are action items. If we were to sit down with a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a whole group of people of different faiths and go through these principles, they're going to agree about with every single one of them. These are eternal teachings. This is the stuff of which religion is made of. This is the core. When we don't do these things, we're not being true to our relationship with God. And I won't go through each one of them, but you're probably familiar with them, but they require really a regular reflection for us to remember that this is the standard and this is what we're capable of doing also. And a lot of the advice that we get here is to protect us. For example, when he says, with all his heart, should the seeker avoid fellowship with evildoers and pray for the remission of their sins. Why? Because bad behavior, bad language, bad ideas, and bad feelings are what? They're like a disease. You catch them. You catch them from other people. If you have a best friend who is uncouth, you'll be uncouth in no time. If you have a best friend who's given to inordinate pleasure seeking, for example, it's really hard to guard yourself from that tendency yourself. It's so important. Baha'u'lláh says you really need to avoid that fellowship and pray for them. Don't abandon them. Pray for them. And here, this forgiving the sinful and never despise his low estate. This is such an important teaching. Sometimes Baha'is think that Baha'u'lláh doesn't teach forgiveness. He teaches justice. No, that's not the case, really. He teaches both justice and forgiveness. And for our relationships with other people, forgiveness is the most important. Justice is the job of the institutions. That's why he created them and called them houses of justice. Because if all of us were involved in judgment, it would be a huge burden. Can you imagine? A lot of us have sort of been brought up in religious communities at one time or another that were extremely righteous, meaning there were lots of people who were telling us what to do and what is right and what is wrong. That is not the kind of spiritual education Baha'u'lláh wants for us. He wants us to be loving and kind and forgiving, and we have institutions to protect us in cases of people who really need help. So those people who we find are violating laws and violating ethics and violating morality, and so we avoid them and we pray for them. Those people eventually have their encounter with justice, and sometimes it turns them around. But sometimes it's our prayers and our forgiveness and our love for them that turns them around. Sometimes when we treat people well, when they treat us poorly, it works on them, and eventually they change in the process. So I'm not going to recite all of this, but there's also something that's very important at the very end of this paragraph here, where Baha'u'lláh talks about nobody is sure what his own end will be. How often at the hour of his soul's ascension, the one who has been faithful and devout has been so changed as to fall into the nethermost fire, or that one who has been rebellious and who has not lived a godly life has been so changed as to take his flight to the celestial concourse. This is such an important teaching for all of us to take to heart, because it protects us from being prideful, from thinking we're better than other people. It protects us and it makes us humble. And if we look at the people who are truly, truly the most spiritual, they're always humble. There are many, many stories of Abdu'l-Baha, whom we know to have been closer to a prophet than a human being. And yet there's so many stories of his patience, his kindness, and his tolerance for obnoxious people, the sort of people that most of us want to run away from as quickly as possible. But Abdu'l-Baha didn't take it personally. He managed to keep his calm demeanor and to say the right thing for that person, so that person could come out of that state of anger and rebellion. So in 215, he says, these are among the attributes of the exalted and constitute the hallmark of the spiritually minded. And then he says that he's talked about these in connection with the path of positive knowledge. He's talking about the path of positive knowledge is the path of the mystic. So as you know, among the very first writings of Baha'u'lláh were those who were addressed to mystics. And that's not because mystics are more important. It's because mystics were the first people who crossed his path. In fact, there's a wonderful story that you can find in Dawnbreakers that even precedes the hidden words, where Baha'u'lláh has an encounter with a Darvish, which were one of those people in Iran who had completely detached themselves from all material things. And many of by the way, Mishkan Kalam, the great calligrapher of the faith, Mishkan Kalam was a Darvish. He was one of this group. And one of the ways you know that he was a Darvish is because he had very long hair. This was an attribute of the Darvish. So Baha'u'lláh encounters this Darvish on the road, and there's an exchange of words between the two. And the Darvish instantaneously recognizes that Baha'u'lláh is speaking with the voice of God. Instantaneously. So, and believe me, this is a guy, he's unwashed, he's wearing ripped, dirty clothing, he's got hair that's much too long and it's tangled. He's a mess, you know? We'd be inclined to say, oh, well, I better lock the doors. We don't want our, we don't want to be contaminated by this person. I mean, he would make a homeless person look like, anyway, he'd be worse than a homeless person. Let's just put it that way. But for Baha'u'lláh, he's a soul looking for God. He's a soul looking for redemption, looking for the path to his Lord. And so he says just the right thing, and the Darvish becomes a follower. We must remember this, that we may be, and this works two ways. When we don't properly understand that it's all in God's hands, we can either become full of pride and complacency, or we can become hopeless. We can look at our own behavior and say, no, I'm never going to the next world. I'm going to go some awful place, because how could God accept me into any world when I have done so poorly in this world? Thank you for those who are putting up these notes, by the way. So we can now go to 216. 216 tells us what will happen after we do this. See, the thing is, you start the search, you have to follow the search following certain criteria, certain psychological criteria, spiritual criteria, ways of thinking and feeling, and then certain actions. And then he says, only when the lamp of search, of earnest striving, of longing desire, of passionate devotion, of fervid love, of rapture and ecstasy is kindled within the seeker's heart, and the breeze of his loving kindness is wafted upon his soul, will the darkness of error be dispelled. So we have to do the seeking and do it right. And we have to take those actions because they're necessary. And only when we reach this peak, this pinnacle of longing desire for God and for awakening to a consciousness, a full consciousness of God, do we come to this new birth. The new birth, which is talked about in the Gospel of John. It's commented on copiously in the talks and tablets of Abdu'l-Baha. It's something that Baha'u'lláh uses different terminology to talk about, but it's the same thing. It's an awakening of the soul, and where we know things in and of themselves, not from the distance of intellect, not even the distance of little flashes of intuition, but to really know them profoundly. And this is the description that he gives here is almost identical to that which you will find in the Valley of Unity in the Seven Valleys. So I recommend that you look at that Valley of Unity, because he talks about what happens when you arrive at a state of existence where you see with a new eye, hear with a new ear, and feel with a new heart, and understand with a new mind. And he says that that is equivalent to seeing and perceiving with the eye of God. So you can imagine that without the manifestation to keep us down to earth, we could all go off into the spiritual realms, and who knows what would happen to us. We'd probably be not very effective at getting things done. So Baha'u'lláh doesn't leave it here. This is very similar to the teaching in Mahayana Buddhism of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is someone who has attained to nirvana, who has attained to awakening. He understands true reality, spiritual, eternal reality, but he makes the choice to spend his earthly existence being of service to others. That's the path of the Baha'i. That's what Baha'u'lláh does differently. He says, don't go to a monastery, don't climb a tree, don't separate yourself from other human beings, get married, have a family, have a career, live in society with that consciousness. Because that consciousness is the consciousness that's going to create a new civilization, which we've been hoping for and praying for and hoping to arrive in our time, that in the Western tradition was called the kingdom of God on earth. Because the kingdom of God in heaven we know, but we want it here, and it can be here. This is where we come to this new consciousness. And the new consciousness, you can't just sort of write it up you can't write a book about it. I mean, I suppose there are lots of books that have been written about it, but you have to experience it. And it's the experience that takes all this work. In other words, there's no shortcut to this lamp of search, earnest striving, longing, desire, passionate devotion. We have to really want it heart and soul. So this Baha'u'lláh has given us an extraordinary window into the spiritual path. And now he's going to move on to another theme here. Yeah, one of the things that's so interesting is that at the same time, Kitáb-i-Íqán is an introduction to not just the faith of the Bab. His arguments are principally to this uncle of the Bab to explain to him who the Bab is and why he should recognize his truth. So you could say this is a teaching book, okay? This is like Bahá'u'lláh in the New Era. It's also, as the Guardian says, the most important doctrinal work of Bahá'u'lláh. So it's a book that the seeker can begin with, and it's a book that will then accompany him for the rest of his life, because we're always going back to it. If we want to understand the hidden words, for example, we need to come back to the Kitáb-i-Íqán. If we want to understand the Kitáb-i-Aqdas, we also have to come back to the Kitáb-i-Íqán. Because in the Kitáb-i-Íqán, we find out what the law of God really is, what its purpose is, and how it changes people. Now, the next passages here are going to be about the city of God. And Baha'u'lláh does what all really effective writers do, which is you give intimations of what you're going to tell somebody, but you don't spill the beans to start with. This is very different from the way we do things nowadays. Nowadays, everybody wants it right now. Give it to me right now, and give it to me in 5 words or less. He's not going to do that. He's going to give you allusions to it, and he's going to do it in such a gentle way. But by the time you reach the punchline, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming because he's completely prepared you to accept the truth of what he means by the city of God. So if you go and you read this as it's all a preface and laying the groundwork. And so now you go to the next paragraph. More clues here. More clues. They that valiantly labor in quest of God's will. Well, that's us, right? That's the person who's the true seeker. You've said, I'm going to be a true seeker, okay? And you commit to doing it. You're in quest of God's will so you can follow it. And so you begin to follow the teachings that are given to you. Do these things, and you do them. And then you're said, when you've renounced all else but him, you will be so attached and wedded to that city that a moment's separation from it would be to them would to them be unthinkable. Now imagine that you're reading these words for the first time and you're thinking, what is this city of God? It's got to be the most important thing in the world. And it is. It is. And that's the whole point, is that Baha'u'lláh is building this so that you come to understand what the central truth from which all other truths come from. And now he's going to say, once in about 1,000 years shall this city be renewed and readorned. Well, the only people, there's a group of people right now who are tuning into this, who know what happens about once every 1,000 years. But most people don't. Because most people don't think that the revelation of of Moses has anything to do with the revelation of Jesus, has anything to do with Muhammad or with Krishna or with Buddha or with any of the others. You see, there's this lack of connection. They see the whole thing as these are isolated occurrences that happen in history, and they don't even speak the same language, and they're speaking to different cultures. And the only one I understand is the one that I follow, and I'm not bothered with anything else. We don't see the big picture, and Baha'u'llah does, and he wants all of us to see the big picture. So the biggest thing of his revelation is he's not only teaching us about his revelation, he's teaching us about what revelation means and what it has been in the past and what it will be in the future. All right, then we go to 219. And now he spills the beans. That city is none other than the word of God, revealed in every age and dispensation. In the days of Moses, it was the Pentateuch, which Jews call the Torah. It's also called Torah in the Quran. In the days of Jesus, the gospel. In the days of Muhammad, the messenger of God, the Quran. In this day, the Bayan. Remember, Baha'u'llah is speaking to him about the Bab. He hasn't told him who he is. And besides, you can't recognize Baha'u'llah. In that time, you couldn't recognize Baha'u'llah unless you recognize the Bab first. Because the Bab was the one who was going to show you the way to Baha'u'llah. Because the Bab, in the Persian Bayan, the major theme of the Persian Bayan are not the laws of the Bab. No. The major theme of that entire book is the coming of him whom God shall make manifest. And that's Baha'u'llah. And that's why the Babis were the first followers of Baha'u'llah. Because they were expecting someone. And when he came, they recognized him. So here Baha'u'llah makes this statement, but it's not just him who's stating this. This is the Bab who taught this. This whole teaching of the book of God being revealed in every age, that is the essence of our connection with the manifestation. And he says, in the dispensation of him whom God will make manifest his own book, the book unto which all the books of former dispensations must needs be referred. The book which standeth amongst them all, transcendent and supreme. That is what the Bab said about him whom God shall make manifest. He said, when he comes, I am like a ring on his finger. He says, just like Jesus, just like John the Baptist said about Jesus, said, I am not worthy to tie his sandals. We're talking about spiritual rank here. The spiritual rank of Baha'u'llah is unimaginably exalted. And the Bab is, in all of his writings, is preparing people to recognize Baha'u'llah. In other words, to use one of my mother's favorite expressions, he's not tooting his own horn. The Bab is tooting Baha'u'llah's horn. So now that he has told us what the city of God is and the role of this word of God in each dispensation, now he's going to go into it and he's going to explain how the Quran was the word of God. Now he has to do that because most of the people who read this book in the original Persian were Muslims. And they were taught that the Torah and the Gospels were not accurate. they're full of errors in them. They were actually falsified by the Jews and Christians so they didn't have any responsibility for recognizing Muhammad. This is what they believed. And Baha'u'lláh addresses those themes in this letter. But first of all, you have to talk about the Quran, because you're talking to a Muslim. And so he talks about how the Quran is the city of God. And let's go on, because he's going to do this. Yes, he's going to do this in 221 as well. And he makes a reference to the year 60. The year 60 in the Hijra calendar, the Islamic calendar, is the year 1260. And that was the year in which the Bab declared. So it's referring to the coming of the Bab. And here you can continue. Here he's talking about the traditions, about how the traditions differ, and many of them are not understood properly. And he says, go back to the Quran. That's really where you need to go. So here's in 222, he quotes one of the traditions. Baha'u'lláh doesn't discount all traditions. He simply says that there are traditions that are false and they're true ones. So he cites the true ones when it's important for the seeker to recognize those understandings. So he says, verily I leave amongst you my twin weighty testimonies, the book of God and my family. So you do know that the Muslims of Iran, of Afghanistan, some of those in Syria, some in Yemen, belong to what is called the Ithna Ashari Shi'i Muslim community. That means that they believe in 12 imams. There are also people who believe in one imam. There are people who believe in 5 imams. There are people who have, within the overall community of people who call themselves Muslims, there are diversity of beliefs related to the family of Muhammad. And Baha'u'lláh is pointing out the Shi'i way of understanding this, that one of the testimonies of Islam, of the true Islam, is through the imams. And there's a great deal written about that in Baha'i literature. Abdu'l-Baha explains it in some answered questions, and in tablets, Baha'u'lláh also explains it. For our purposes in reading this book, it's very important that we understand where he's going with this. Because he says, initially, there were 2 twin testimonies, the book of God and the family. So that is the 12 imams and the Quran. And then he says, and then instead of emphasizing the family, for example, he's only talking about the book. It's very interesting here. He says, with unswerving vision, with pure heart and sanctified spirit, consider attentively what God hath established as the testimony of guidance for his people in his book, which is recognized as authentic by both the high and lowly. And then he comes to the punchline. Inasmuch as Muhammad hath confined his testimonies to his book and to his family, and whereas the latter hath passed away, there remaineth his book only, as his one testimony amongst the people. This clears the brush. It clears all of the obstacles for the Muslim who can grasp his thinking to understand. If you want to recognize the Bab and later if you want to recognize Baha'u'lláh, you must let go of all of the traditions and all of the commentaries and all of the thinking of Muslims for 1400 years, because they are based on partial understandings and often erroneous understandings of what the Quran is teaching. You have to go back to the Quran. You have to go and study the Quran yourself and compare the Quran with what the Bab says in the Bayan and what Baha'u'lláh says in his writings. And if you do, if you have the courage and independence of thinking to do that, Baha'u'lláh has assured that those who will do so without prejudice will come to recognize the truth of the Bab's manifestation and of his own claims. This is such a powerful thing for us too to understand, because the book of God for us, this book by which we can understand all other books, because that's what he said. All the truths that are revealed in previous scriptures are explained and put in proper context by Baha'u'llah's writings. And that revelation is available now increasingly, progressively, because more and more of it is being translated into different languages and made available to people living in different countries. And more of it is also being published in the original Persian and Arabic. So let's go to the next one. Now, this is an indispensable principle that's talked about by the Bab in the 7 proofs as well. If we were to try to recognize a manifestation based upon all the things that are said or written about him, we will probably fail. We will be led down the primrose path to a misunderstanding, because they conflict with each other. And many of them are written in such manner as to basically create a tradition of understanding that is composed of the ideas of the people rather than the revelation of God. You see, the revelation of God did not come to the Arab people to make them the masters of the world. That was not the purpose. The purpose was to make them the purveyors of this new truth that came to them in the wilderness. But after they decided that they would go and conquer much of the world, then they wanted to interpret things as a way of justifying their behavior. And consequently, many of the hadith do. They justify violent, ruthless behavior for which there is no justification in the Quran itself. And Baha'u'lláh has made this very clear. This is why it's so important for Muslims to let go of that tradition. The same is true of Christians and of Jews and of many other faiths as well. We have so many ideas, we have so much baggage, and if we bring the baggage with us, we have a very hard time, and usually are unsuccessful in finding out what Baha'u'lláh is saying. We have to drop the baggage at the door and go in and find out what reality is for ourselves. So this is all about the Quran. This is, by the way, a tremendous inspiration for those of us in the West to actually read the Quran. To read the Quran and read it in the light of what Baha'u'lláh says about it. Not just in this treatise, but in other tablets that he revealed. And Abdul Baha also has written a great deal about the different chapters of the Quran. The Quran is really indispensable reading for Baha'is in the long term. He even says that for Western people to come to a true understanding of Islam, they need to be taught by the Baha'is. Now we have 225. So if there's, I've gone through 2, 3, maybe 4 really major themes of Kitáb-i-Íqán relatively quickly. If anybody would like to say something or ask a question, why don't we do it now?
So everyone should be able to unmute themselves and to start their video now if they want to.
Just imagine that instead of us being scattered all over the world and looking at laptop screens, we were actually sitting around a kitchen table, okay? And I'm taking a coffee break. I'm going to get you some coffee or tea or whatever you want to drink, and you're going to tell me what you really think, okay? Because that's what you can do at a kitchen table. So I want you to feel as if we're all sitting together, because I feel that way towards you. I've come to realize that Zoom is only a barrier in my own mind. It's not a barrier in reality.
Oops.
So I can tell from the tone of that laughter that one of our members is going to say something. Go ahead. Lucinda. Or is that Juanita?
I didn't say anything.
You didn't say anything, but you unmuted. So I saw that you were unmuted.
Oh, excusez-moi, excusez-moi.
No, it's
I thought
okay.
it was Sharon that was giggling.
Oh, Sharon was giggling. I can recognize that across thousands of miles. But maybe, yes, Joyce, speak.
So just from your, excuse me, your personal perspective, and I apologize for being late, what would be a good starting point for someone who's not familiar with Islam or the Quran to sort of start diving in? I mean, I've started, but I'm just wondering what direction you might point people in, because I would agree it's really important to do that.
We have a very valuable resource, which is there seem to be lots of people who like creating compilations, okay? And there are some compilations there, and there's undoubtedly at least one on Bahá'u'lláh.com, which will give you all of the translated references to the Quran, citations in the writings of Baha'u'lláh and Abdul Baha. If you go there and you read those and read how they're used by Baha'u'lláh and Abdul Baha, I think that's a really good beginning. Really good beginning. because any other way of reading the Quran first is arbitrary. It's arbitrary for me to say, well, we just start with Al-Fatiha and then read it all the way to the end. No, that could be of value to you, but it may be not of any value at all. If you instead you immerse yourself in the interpretations of Baha'u'lláh and the interpretations of Shoghi Effendi and how those verses have been treated by them, cited by them, you get a composite picture. Then you can do something that's a lot of fun to do, and people have already done it, so that there'll be resources for you. You can study the Quran thematically. You can find a particular theme that interests you, and then somebody has come up with all of the texts that have to do with that particular thing. Like maybe you're fascinated with the creation. How did everything come into existence? And what sustains everything? And you want to see, what does the Quran say about that? That can be done. There's so many themes. Years ago, I taught a course on Quran for the Wilmette Institute, and I took the thematic approach because I thought that this was better for rank beginners than any other. I do think that it's fairly important when you're studying a text that's daunting and unfamiliar to do it bit by bit. It's like going to a feast. Yes, it's a feast, but you don't have to eat everything. Right? And if you do try to eat everything, you're going to get indigestion afterwards. Right? So do it over time. If you can do it with a group of people, wonderful. If you happen to have a member of your group that speaks Arabic and can read in Arabic, then so much the better for you. Because in Arabic, the Quran is indescribably different from in English. It's as are the Baha'i writings, as is the Bayan. And even if you get a little taste of the Arabic, it makes such a difference. And then you go and you look up specific words. There's some tricks. There's some tricks that I learned in graduate school, because in graduate school it's really funny. They tell you, well, it's going to take you 10 years to learn Arabic. So I only lasted in grad school for 1 year. It was just too much. But they said it's going to take you 10 years, but then they gave you all these tools so that very quickly you can decode the meaning of words that you're encountering. So it's not like you won't understand the Arabic that you're reading, because that you can understand with the right tools. And those tools are miraculously all available on the internet. And there's no, and increasingly, there are really good commentaries. There's really good historical material as well. The resources are there. The universe is the internet is our universe now. You just have to get people to point you in the right direction. And I'd be happy to help in any way to those who are interested. After we finish this course, I could put up a list of resources. By the way, there's a list of resources for the Kitáb-i-Íqán too, because a number of people have written beautifully articles and books about it, including Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah.
He has.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I hope you understood that. You know, appetite for this kind of deep study. Yes, there's a wonderful tutorial by Fazil. How do you pronounce Fazil's last name?
Nagdi.
Hmm?
Nagdi.
Nagdi. Okay.
Yeah.
And Christopher Buck has written a terrific book also on the Kitáb-i-Íqán in a number of articles. There's marvelous stuff out there. And luckily for us, Baha'is haven't really tried to explain every verse yet, which is good. It's very important to understand that it's good to have mysteries. Mysteries are important. Mysteries are what propel us to continue to search. If we could find everything, then why would we bother anymore? You know, we would think that we're done. Oh, it's done. I remember there's a wonderful Pilgrim's note that an American was visiting Haifa and was talking with the Guardian and said, yeah, we have these study groups and we meet and we do the Íqán in a weekend. The Guardian said, you do the Íqán in a weekend? So he didn't have to really say anything else. I think the person understood what he was talking about. But that's just such a quintessentially modern American way of thinking that, you know, we can actually just get it all done, right? So where's the text? What happened to the text? You've replaced the text with a wobbly me.
I'll put the text back on.
Which is I'm starting to think that I'm a character on some
No, what I
Mr.
found
Bean.
is, Peter, if we stop your video, it resets the issue. But we'll fix this issue afterwards.
Okay.
We won't have this problem anymore.
Yeah, I'm not really schizophrenic or hyperactive.
Well,
Yeah.
you know, as we're reading here, Bahá'u'lláh is so very clear and precise and repeatedly shares, you know, all the clarity in the world. It just, you know, it's just amazing. Like in 223, you know, with unswavering vision and with pure heart and sanctified spirit, consider attentively what God hath established as the testimony of guidance for his people in this book. You know, it's just so beautiful. I mean, it's so clear and precise and gives us that guidance and where to go, you know, how to prepare ourselves to be in this place.
Yes. And I think of this, you know, there are many references to teaching in the gleanings, where Baha'u'lláh is talking about teaching. He's talking about it as an obligation. He's talking about how we have to live the teachings in order to teach them. He's talking about eloquence, how important eloquence and wisdom is. He talks about divine inspiration. He says, when you go and you speak, God will protect you and will guide you. And the concourse on high is there, present to assist you. But this doesn't absolve us from having to immerse ourselves in the Word of God at all. The Word of God is the center. If we don't have the Word of God permeating us, neither can we actually adequately follow the teachings, because we won't be doing them spiritually. We'll be doing them by rote. We'll just be doing them sort of like well, I was told to do this, so I'm going to do it. So there's no understanding, you know.
Yeah.
But also, we will be completely unable to teach in the way that he's describing, because to teach is to be. It's not to talk about something else. It's to talk about the thing that permeates you, right? That is, and then you are really speaking. You're speaking to the heart of the person without even knowing, because this is we have a gift of guidance when we're teaching that we don't have in anything else necessarily. I mean, those people who are engaged in making decisions in the houses of justice also have guidance, but every one of us can do this as teachers. And one of the things he says, and this is a challenge to this day and age, and that is we have to memorize. We have to learn those things that strike us as being, you know I can't memorize this entire book, but I'm going to find the pithy statements here that I'm going to need to refer back to because they say so much to me. Like one of the ones that I've mentioned this several times since we began this, is that there's one to put up on your refrigerator, because one of the ones that I can only recall as a paraphrase and not the exact quote is, reading without understanding is of no abiding profit. Why is that important to me? Because we so often think that if we do a whole bunch of reading or read things over and over again, quantity, that's what matters. It's never the case. It's always the quality. And Bahá'u'lláh reiterates that when he says that we should read the writings in the morning and the evening. And he says don't think that this means you're supposed to bear down on the soul and cause it to languish by overly reading. No, that's not the purpose. He says if you recite one verse with joy, that is preferable to reading all of the writings without joy. That's certainly true of the Kitáb-i-Íqán.
Can I just add something there, Peter? Yes, we have to recite the verses. We really do. That's foremost. But for people who are not able to do that, a lot of people in my country, they have a whole kind of like range. I mean, it depends on what you're presenting it to. For simple people, it's really good just to have a lot of my spiritual parents and that they used to take the books everywhere. So all of our shoes that were like their trailers, we had to kind of like we were all we all lined up and had to carry the gleanings and all the other books so that, the pure word and the whole fundamental thing of this is, yes, we train, we call ourselves to account, we observe, we immerse, we do all of that daily and as much as possible. But the bottom line is the real transformative medicine is actually the word, and different ways for different people, depending on your circumstances and environment work. Yes, we still do have to. I find just being able to memorize at 73 things like the hidden words is great, because at least I can go away and say, oh my God, well, at least I've fed them. Because, for my culture, food is a spiritual thing, and the writings are really the essence of everything, because yes, it is empathy, it's all of the things you've mentioned, but I'm just trying to encourage people who live in areas that are very marginalized and stuff and are dealing with very grassroots people, that you can actually my friends laminate quotations. So if anyone comes in our company, we usually give the laminate. Beautiful, they put beautiful design, the word and talk the word and then present that. So the person goes away with that, so that their connection with you is that. I just wanted to, for people that perhaps are great at other things, but maybe their memorization, depending on what stage they're at life, isn't that great. Just putting it there. Thank you.
I want to share something from my youth. When I first encountered the faith, I was 19. And I encountered it in Portland, Maine, and then in Boston, Massachusetts. And at that time, we had lots of blue-haired ladies. Remember the blue-haired ladies? And the blue-haired lady Baha'is, who'd been Baha'is forever, as far as we could tell, they had certain ways of doing things, and nobody messed with the blue-haired ladies. They say to do something, you do it. That's it. And I remember the blue-haired ladies, very often they would have, and each one was different, but they'd have a little card. And on the card, they'd have a Baha'i principle, where they'd have one quotation. It was very short. And then on the back, they'd have their name and their telephone number or their address or something, so you could get in touch with them or with the Baha'is in a certain community. And I discovered when I was in high school, I knew a Baha'i and I met his family, and nothing about the faith registered for me at that time consciously. But my friend gave me a pamphlet. And 2 years later, when I was in a fierce search for truth, I came by the pamphlet. And I read the pamphlet and I said, Mom, we need to go to one of these firesides and find out what these Baha'is are doing. And we went and we became Baha'is after one fireside. Why? Because the pamphlet, he'd put the pamphlet in my hand. If he hadn't put the pamphlet in my hand, I might never have seen it again. We have to remember we can't sort of trust everything to the internet. There's too much other stuff on the internet. You can't count on everybody's going to find the faith through the internet. Sometimes it's the fact that somebody who is kind and gentle and warm to you gives you something and you hold on to it, that at the right time you read it.
That's it.
Yeah. And that's what I mean, these quotations, finding something that resonates, because that was something the blue-haired ladies knew how to do. They'd say, you need to read the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah, right now. I want to see that you read the Will and Testament. Next week, I want to see that you finished reading it, And she was right, because she understood, you're a hippie and you need to understand their rules and regulations. And Abdu'l-Baha was nice and liberal in his talks, and the Will and Testament, he's going to, let you have it. And you need that, because you need to understand that you're a Baha'i now, and being a Baha'i is not what you thought it was. You thought it was seals and crofts, right? Oh, wow. That was the beginning. Now you're going to, you're dumping in, you're going into the deep end. So I think that's something very, very important for people to do. And the more individual you make it, our National Publishing Trust used to make all these cards available and pamphlets available to people. I don't know whether they just discontinued because people weren't giving them out anymore. But frankly, if you make something yourself and it's personalized, it has a more impact. Now, are we at 225?
I believe so.
Yes.
were we to expound its inner meanings and unfold its hidden mysteries, eternity would never suffice to exhaust their import, nor would the universe be capable of hearing them. God verily testifieth to the truth of our saying. Well, that's not something you hear every day, is it? I mean, anybody who speaks like that has got to have a cosmic consciousness that's greater than anything we know. And yet here he's saying it about the truth of the Quran. And whoso hath failed to acknowledge the truth of the Quran hath in reality failed to acknowledge the truth of the preceding scriptures. Now, if that isn't a call to action for Baha'is to go read the Quran, I don't know what is. Because Baha'u'lláh is not just telling you to go and read the writings of the Bab here. He could have done that. He could have said, don't worry about all these other scriptures, you know. Go and read the Bab. But he didn't. He said, go and read the scriptures that you're familiar with and see them in a different way. Let's go to 226. Yeah. I have the feeling that so far everything we've talked about today, we talked about last time, but I don't think there's anything harmful in that, because nobody raised their hand and said, hey, we talked about this last week. So it seems like going over things is, you know, just as fine, you know. Baha'u'lláh is pushing every single button here in order for us to understand this truth that the book is of central importance. And so this is a bit complicated for Baha'is, because then we go, well, which book? In the case of previous revelations, it was one book. The Torah, the Gospels, the Quran. In the case of Baha'u'lláh, and for that matter, the case of the Bab, but to look at the case of Baha'u'lláh, he wrote over 100 volumes. And the book, which book to give, which book to study, depends so much on what your soul is thirsting for. It can't really be one book for everybody. There are some people who are thirsting for the language of the hidden words. And when they read that language, they will fall in love. And that will be it. That will be the beginning of their love affair. There are others who have highly logical minds, high training in the sciences. They want to see, how do you rationally explain the Baha'i teachings? Some answered questions. Some answered questions. It's absolutely brilliant. Others will be, you know, they'll want to know what were Baha'u'llah's teachings to the kings? How did he address kings and rulers and assemblies, people who are making decisions for large populations? So we know where to push them. You know, we know where to, what they can immerse themselves in. As one of you pointed out, the Kitáb-i-Íqán, for somebody who is of a certain temperament, the Aqdas can be the book that opens doors for them. But each one of these we have to follow our intuition. We have to follow our inner wisdom. You know when the sensitivity of the person that you're talking to, and when they come to you and they say, well, what do you think is the right book for me? If you know that person, you'll have a strong feeling of which book that they should start with. And this is why the master and the guardian said it was so important for us to individually bring into the faith the soul, rather than to do a sort of rather than to just introduce them to the community and have the community handle them. And the blessings really of being a teacher to somebody until they are firmly established in their faith, the blessings of that are very substantial, because by guiding them in the right direction, we confirm our own guidance. This is true of any teacher. You don't really know second grade math until you teach second grade math. Then you know it. Okay, I can tell you that because I've got a little girl that we're teaching second grade math to. But that's so true of anything, that when you teach it, it's a whole new perspective and it reinforces us. And I think, and it's not scary. It shouldn't be scary at all. You don't have to go to seminary to teach the faith. Not at all.
And the real thing though, Peter, is to teach is actually to learn.
Yeah.
And it's a reciprocal relationship. To teach, you know, a lot of people have a very bad concept around teaching. I'm not talking about Baha'is, but in general. You know, the whole thing about doing that is, as you've said, but in a simple way, when you teach somebody the faith, yes, you're reaffirming your own, but you learn something else to add to that. So each person is a blessing and a gift to you to give that to. I just wanted to do it in my kind of through my own lens. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, in the Gleanings, there's a passage for Bahá'u'lláh that's reiterated by the house that that we must never give the impression that we are superior to anyone.
That's right.
Because it's not only because it's not true, but because it's a turnoff.
Yep.
Nobody wants to learn from somebody who is acting superior. It doesn't work with human relationships. We're attracted to those people who we feel accepted by and approved by and loved by, principally. There's a letter of Paul that talks about that too. In Ephesians, he's talking about how, you know, you teach people not according to your knowledge, but according to your love.
There's you know, to go a little further with what Sharon was talking about, the people that disagree or think that you're crazy and have all these things, I learned a lot from those people also, because I'm like, oh, interesting, you know, they have fascinating ideas, and I dive into the writings to learn about it.
Yeah. It's awesome. It's a process, isn't it?
So let's go to 227. We have just a little while. I have to tell you that there's something about when the manifestation of God shows his human side, shows his frailty, shows his tenderness. It's just so emotional for me. Like the story of Joseph, when his sons his brothers come and meet him, and he finally reveals who he is, and he weeps. I weep when I read it. I weep when I read it, because there's something so beautiful about this soul who has all knowledge and yet suffers with us, experiences our sufferings and experiences them together. There's a story of Jesus when Martha and Mary come to Jesus and say, Lazarus, our brother, has died. Will you please come and see if you can do something? And he weeps. These are his friends. And he weeps. It says Jesus wept. And here Bahá'u'lláh is talking about this. He says, "O friend, it behooveth us not to waive the injunction of God, but rather acquiesce and submit to that which he hath ordained as his divine testimony." And Bahá'u'lláh says this verse is too weighty and pregnant an utterance for this afflicted soul to demonstrate and expound. We're reminded Bahá'u'lláh is not back at court in Tehran, leaning on his silk and satin cushions with people, with whatever other pleasures they had in that extremely luxuriant environment. He's in Baghdad. He's in Baghdad, and he's in Baghdad living in very, very simple circumstances because he's still a prisoner. He's a prisoner where the kings of Turkey and the king of Iran haven't yet decided what they're going to do with him. So he's actually, the Damocles sword is hanging over his head. So he's definitely an afflicted soul. And there are other times when Bahá'u'lláh will say, I would go more into detail on this, but I can't. I can't do it. And I personally, I just get so emotionally caught up in those because of that. I can imagine him and how kind and tender he is to those people around him, how completely unlike what we ascribe to God and his manifestations. Tend to think that God's really mean, nasty, bossy, masculine. No, not very. I think that's a tremendous misunderstanding. There's so much love there. Bahá'u'lláh says that his teachings are there. If we would but understand the teachings, we would understand that this is what we need. These should be more precious to us than anything in the world. And the more we study them, the more we can discover what he means by that.
It's also, Peter, about that's the manifestation of God, and he's showing us how to have vulnerability through this revelation, so that in actual fact we're being very authentic and genuine, because in reality, intimately, if we have that association and relationship as best we can on this level with that most great love, the beloved, then the people that we come in contact with in our everyday lives too, some part of that affects them, if we can do that. And that actual vulnerability, a lot of us don't recognize that, but that means stripping away our social masks. It's a painful process to actually get down to your core, to be able, for the love of that blessed beauty, not for any social gain but in order to give this message, you have to strip yourself naked. And it can make you understand to your human degree when the manifestations of God did this, what were they saying? They were saying this on many levels, but on a very human level to us. They were telling us, your vulnerability is the most authentic and truthful part of who you really are. And that also, added to all those other things that you've discussed, really enables that true connection of heart to heart. Even if this is on an intellectual level, still those characteristics create a bond, and that bond can be built on. I just wanted to put that in there, and thank you again.
Baha'u'lláh talks about his sufferings and to remember his sufferings. Remember in the Tablet of Ahmad, he talks about that. He talks about it in a number of other prayers in particular. And there's great wisdom in that statement that it's taken years for it to be sort of unraveled for me, is to understand that his suffering is what makes us love him and want to help. Because if God doesn't hurt, and if his messenger doesn't hurt, if he's invulnerable, then he doesn't need our help. So why should I make huge sacrifices of my life to help you when you've got everything covered? But you don't have everything covered. That's the reality, because we were created to complement our Creator and to do what the Creator asks us to do so that our lives will be better, right? It's not to improve his life, it's to improve our lives. That's his compassion for us, is that he often suffers because we're doing things that are bad for us. And Christians have a good understanding of this very often. It's interesting to look at different religious communities and say what they have a good clue on, but there are other traditions that so emphasize the sublimity of the manifestation that the followers don't really have this feeling of empathy for him. Payam, you want to say something? Say.
I just thought I'd touch on this point a little bit. So this whole idea of the manifestations of God's suffering is a very interesting one, because for one, we know that when we're speaking about God himself, he's completely, not related to his creation. So whatever happens in this life, it doesn't affect God in any way, but his manifestations have this level of humanity which shows the suffering to us. Now, God, he didn't have to do that to guide us. He didn't have to make these manifestations of God to suffer. So then you ask yourselves, why is that happening in the first place? There's a very interesting story that Bahá'u'lláh talks that explains to a believer. And then the believer asked Bahá'u'lláh, why didn't God send manifestations of God? Why didn't he just come down himself and teach humanity? And then Bahá'u'lláh said, imagine a parrot. So when you put a mirror in front of the parrot and you stand behind it and you start speaking, the parrot looks into the mirror and thinks that mirror is speaking to him. So he learns to speak in that way. But as soon as you move the mirror away and he sees you, the parrot becomes scared and does not learn anything. So the point of this story is that the manifestations of God are created in our likeness, so we can understand, the qualities and attitudes that come along with the idea of the names and qualities of God. Because when we say manifestation, in actuality, the whole sentence is the manifestations and the names and attributes of God.
Yes.
So it's not the reality of God himself, but the suffering that we see in the manifestations are for our own sake. They didn't have to suffer, but they did. Baha'u'lláh says, I am suffering for the sake of humanity. And he actually said that. And It's for us to humble ourselves. And, another reason why they're always in poverty is like if they came along as kings and very rich people and started preaching, they wouldn't be taken as seriously. So they were put in positions of suffering and, poverty. And so people look at this example and be like, wow, so this is a prophet of God, and this is the example they're led by. So it's a very beautiful example to us all.
Thank you. I'm reminded of there's a novel by Hermann Hesse called Siddhartha, which is his retelling of the story of Gautama Buddha, who was also called Siddhartha Buddha. And the Buddha was a prince in a very, very wealthy family. And he renounced everything when he had this call to enlightenment. And so there's that example as well of a manifestation who sacrifices everything because everything is nothing. That's the thing. What we think in this world is that all of these things are actually important, but they're not. They're not. And so it really, every one of the manifestations is put. I mean, look, Moses was adopted as a son of Pharaoh. We know that the pharaohs lived in a very opulent lifestyle. That they didn't have hundreds; they had millions of slaves. And here he was brought up, in the very family of Pharaoh. He was treated like a prince himself, but again, he leaves it all behind. He leaves it all behind because he's following the call from God, and the call from God that's from the creator of the king. That puts everything in perspective. And Bahá'u'lláh is often speaking like that, where he says, I don't need your treasures. I don't want your power. This is not for me. So we're going to have to leave it for here because we have about 5 minutes, but I'm very happy that you all joined today, and I look forward to your return next week. And this particular the text of the rest of the Kitáb-i-Íqán with questions, and the questions really are, I put them in there to tickle your thinking, not necessarily referring even specifically to a particular verse in the paragraph, but just something to consider after reading the paragraph. Because I regard all learning to be dialectical. All learning is essentially having a conversation with someone else. And here we're having a conversation with Bahá'u'lláh. And Bahá'u'lláh is speaking to us differently. I would be very surprised if I heard from each of you and found that you all had the same impression of something that we're reading together. So I wish you a wonderful week, and we'll see you soon.
Have a good evening, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.